Okay, folks, welcome. Start the webinar a little bit early. Let folks come in, and as you come in, you'll see a poll. So if you wouldn't mind putting your view here on the poll, and we'll discuss that a bit as we get started. Give it a couple of minutes for everybody to come on in and have their say about Mr. Brown.
We love it when people tell us where they're joining from. So I see we have Westport, Connecticut. So feel free to tell us where you are tonight.
Yes, our friend from Westport, Mr. Cronson.
Bruce, we have someone from Hawaii. That could
Oh,
be, she
wow.
could have the prize so far.
Yes, we'd love to do a remote from Hawaii sometime.
New York, New Jersey.
Don't want to forget about our Massachusetts friends,
Right.
Stoughton and Tewksbury, Peabody. Everybody watched the Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Jimmy Fallon, where they said every single town in Massachusetts in a quasi Boston accent.
Bruce, we have an attendee that says John Brown is her sixth cousin, four times removed. So
Wow.
that should get some sort of prize there as well.
Yes. Well, John Brown did have, he had 20 children, 11 of which survived into adulthood. So there's, I assume, a lot of descendants, one way or another, from Mr. Brown.
And Bruce, just let me know when you want me to end the poll.
Okay. I see people still coming in, so it is slowing down. Another descendant. Oh, that same person. Piscataway, New Jersey. Another person said John Brown was a cousin from Studley, Virginia. Well, so some people are pretty well schooled in Mr. Brown lore then if they're a descendant of theirs. Okay, I think you can stop the poll now, Lisa. It looks like people coming in has kind of slowed down. So taking a look at that, not unexpected. Obviously, most people here are from the North, but the winner is controversial but an important figure. Close behind is a heroic abolitionist, and then a violent extremist, kind of equaling with not familiar enough to say. Uh, there is no doubt that he is a complicated man. Purpose of this presentation is not to convince you of anything really, except how interesting the story is and how wide-reaching it is, and also how a lot of uh, pertinent monuments and references to Mr. Brown exist today. I was surprised when I got into this. I didn't realize how many different, quite frankly, rabbit holes I would go down and visit various areas that had a relation to John Brown's life. And I certainly did not cover all of them. I certainly was not in Ohio, where he spent most of his formative years, but getting ahead of myself. And let's see here. This please will.
I'll stop sharing the poll now, Bruce, if that's okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. So actually, for people who haven't attended these webinars, my name is Bruce Magnuson. I am primarily a photographer in Chelmsford, Mass. My wife, Lisa, is hosting. So she'll be kind of trying to keep me on track. These presentations kind of have a few levers of art, history, and travel underlined with photography, depending upon the subject. You'll see more or less of some of those with always a lot of photography. So this one will be focused mostly on history and travel. We'll dabble into some art. There's obviously a lot of literature about Mr. Brown, certainly paintings and statues. My introduction to John Brown goes back to the band Kansas. If people are familiar with 1970s prog rock, but their first album cover was Tragic Prelude, which we'll get to at the Topeka Capitol in Kansas. That was their motif, and they actually continue that with their greatest hits album. They used the John Brown caricature there. Um, This is a current T-shirt you can purchase. Don't argue with people who John Brown would have shot. I don't you don't endorse that, but it is something that's out there. And probably the most famous reference to Mr. Brown is the tune "John Brown's Body," and we'll give a little snippet of that, which I'm sure you'll be remote. My cursor will cooperate.
Oh, John Brown's body lies molding in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured out to save. And though he lost his life in his struggle to free the slaves, his truth is marching on.
So, familiar tune. Obviously, that's the tune that was used for Battle Hymn of the Republic. That is written by Julia Ward Howe, and there is a relationship between Julia Ward Howe and John Brown. So we'll get to that as well. But that song was a very, very popular song and sung by a lot of the Union soldiers during the Civil War. Why my little thing here is not working? So there's been some recent books that get into this space as well. Charles Poland's America's Good Terrorist, John Brown on the Harper Valley Raid, and Even Carton, Patriotic Treason, John Brown and the Soul of America. So with that, like I said, we'll try and take a break in between each of these different areas on the agenda. If you have questions, pop them in the chat there, and we'll try and address those as we go along at each break. Like I said, there's a lot of content here, so I do want to be mindful I don't go on too long about it, but we're going to get into an introduction and early life of Mr. Brown. We're going to switch over to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he spent a few years of importance. Go to Bleeding, Kansas, talk about the Secret Six, who were kind of behind a lot of him financially and philosophically. Go to the main thing that people know him for is Harpers Ferry, and certainly in North Elba, where he lived in the Adirondacks, and then wrap up with some talk on the legacy. So with that, we'll do an introduction, early life. So this basically is our map, literally, of where we're going to be going. So a lot here in New England, here in Massachusetts, and in Connecticut. We will venture up to the Adirondacks. We will go down to West Virginia, which was actually part of Virginia at the time Harper's Ferry happened in 1859. And then we'll venture west into the Midwest and Kansas and take a look at areas in eastern Kansas where the Kansas-Missouri border and all of the interactions that happened during Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s that John Brown was involved in. So that's pretty much where we're jumping around, a pretty wide swath of America. And it was a lot of fun visiting these places, I will say that. So he is born in 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, which is west of Hartford here. There is some stuff at his birthplace. There are just remnants of a couple of buildings, the house he was born in, and some outbuildings, I believe, is down a rather desolate road. You've got to kind of look for it in Torrington, Connecticut. Lisa was at another event in Connecticut, and I was looking around for things that might be interesting to visit and photograph, and lo and behold, I found John Brown's birthplace. So, as I said, there are some markers. There's one here that indicates it, and this is an outline of a foundation of one of the buildings. His father was a merchant, relatively successful. This is the house they lived in. It was purchased by his father, Owen Brown, in 1799, and John Brown, I believe, was his oldest child. He was born in 1800, and that's an old picture of it. Obviously, it's no longer standing. But pretty soon, I think like 5 years or so after John Brown was born, his father, Owen, moves to the Western Reserve of Ohio. And the Western Reserve of Ohio is kind of this interesting place that was actually claimed by Connecticut. And it is settled by people from Connecticut. So it's this kind of quasi part of Connecticut here on Lake Erie. And Akron, Ohio, today is the town where he grew up mostly. There is a museum out there in Akron, Ohio, and he spent most of his formative years in Ohio. But Connecticut Western Reserve is an interesting place in the fact that it was ceded to the United States after the Revolutionary War, but it is still part of Connecticut, and it's this really intensely anti-slavery section of the country. So it is known as the most intensely anti-slavery section, and it is also known as the New England of the West. So even though it's in Ohio, which of course, back in those days is northwest, anything west of the Appalachians, at that point is, kind of the wild, literally the Wild West. Is the original 13 colonies really didn't go much west of the Appalachians by actually design with Great Britain and treaties of the indigenous populations. That obviously changes after the Revolutionary War, but Ohio certainly is not a state at this point when they move out there. So I do want to give a little bit of context into kind of the whole, area and historic milieu, for lack of a better term, of what John Brown is dealing with in this time from 1800 up until basically he dies in 1859, which is just a year and a half before the Civil War starts in 1861. So there's the infamous three-fifths clause, which is Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And basically, it counts slaves as three-fifths. And it is changed by the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. But up until that point, there are obviously more slaves down south of the Mason-Dixon line than there are north. And those are counted for representational purposes when they're doing the first census, which is how apportionment happens and how you get particularly the number of members of the House of Representatives. So that is a big deal as to how things are going to be with regard to government and with regard to, policy, bills being voted on, all that kind of stuff. So, it's a complicated space with the three-fifths clause. There is the argument that without the three-fifths clause, there would not be United States because the South was not going to agree unless there was some sort of accommodation of slavery. Obviously, slavery is not expressly mentioned in the Constitution. There is the term slavery does not exist in the Constitution, and you can see how they kind of dance around it here. But this really is the major thing that has an impact as far as legislation goes after the 1787 Constitutional Convention up until the Civil War. So this is a map of kind of what that means. And this shaded area is basically kind of the thumb on the scale of what the three-fifths clause does as far as a number of seats in Congress. And so you see the number of seats in Congress are, they're not astronomical, but even, you can imagine within today's environment where, a couple of votes one way or the other can make a big deal. So the fact that the three-fifths clause is there counting the slave population for apportionment does have a large impact on the legislation that is able to be passed or not be passed in the United States. And that has a lot to do with the space that John Brown is operating in. And you can see the U.S. Slave population does go up here from about 700,000 when the country starts in 1790 up to around 4 million just before the Civil War. So it goes almost 6-7-fold. And the U.S. population does go up quite a lot too. The slave population isn't necessarily totally disproportionate to that, but the number of slaves you're talking about at the time of the Constitution versus what happens right at the Civil War is significantly different. And there are some thoughts that, the founding fathers were thinking slavery would kind of die out on its own. Two things kind of make that not happen. One is the Louisiana Purchase, and the other one is the cotton gin. And so those are able to allow these large cotton plantations that exist down in the deep South, places like Mississippi, places like Alabama, places like Louisiana. They have a disproportionate amount of the slave population. And by the time the Civil War starts, 20% of the nation's wealth is invested in slaves, more than factories and railroads combined. And 60% of all exports, which is principally cotton, as I said, the big cotton plantations down in the deep South, was produced by slave labor. And this is an interesting historical document. This actually comes from the archives. It's available a lot of different places, but I came across it in the archives of Yale University, trying to get more into original primary sources. And this is actually the secession document from the state of Mississippi when it secedes from the Union. And this is literally the first two paragraphs. The bolding is mine, but the words are exactly what was in it. And it says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world, as labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. So not too much ambiguity there. John Brown says, I hold God in infinitely greater reverence than Congress. And this is what he's getting at. Talk is a national institution, but it does not help the slave. So where he gets frustrated with is, there's all this kind of, discussion, debate in Congress about slavery. We'll get into some of the specific things that happened in the mid 1800s, but his view is like, this is all, going on, but it's not doing anything to help the slave. It's a lot of talk, not a lot of action. Say what you will about John Brown, he was a man of action. And the other thing that's kind of foundational to Mr. Brown, I think, is trying to understand the environment he's from, which is not unique to him, but he is a Calvinist. And, this is a derivation of the original, at least here in New England, the original founding by the Puritans, very Calvinist sect. And that is, he was born in Connecticut, very much of a Puritan background in the late 1700s, early 1800s in the United States. And so they have these 5 points of Calvinism, which is cleverly called TULIP: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And so the reason I bring that up is to the quote before where he talks, he's paying attention more to God than he is to Congress. He did see himself as a agent of God. I mean, that's how he viewed himself. Once again, you can debate, the merits of that, but that is how he viewed himself. And this is the underlying kind of theological stuff that was really very, very, it's not radical in the fact that, Calvinism had a very huge impact in the Protestant world and certainly in, history in the United States and in Europe. So he's coming from all that background is what I'm trying to set up here. So with that, we kind of jump forward. So as I mentioned before, he was born in Ohio, what is today Ohio, and he did grow up there. But he works his way back east in the mid 1840s. One of the interesting things about John Brown is he's a really, really bad businessman, very unsuccessful as far as business goes. Not a stupid guy, but his kind of demeanor, the way he looked at things, very much of a black and white thing, was not terribly successful as a businessman. He certainly knew his stuff. He knew, like, he was very big into raising sheep. He was very, very astute with, knowing all the ins and outs of sheep farming and stuff like that, but he wasn't really good about transitioning that into an actual profitable business. So one of the things that he does is he gets in cahoots with, I guess, like one of the richest men in Ohio, and goes back to Massachusetts to try and work with the manufacturers of textiles, with Ohio growing the sheep and the wool, which is a supply for that. So he becomes kind of this wool broker in Springfield, Massachusetts. So probably the most famous thing historically in Springfield, Massachusetts is the Springfield Armory. And so, we'll get to Harpers Ferry, but at the point in the United States, basically there are two federal armories. There's one in Springfield and there's one in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Like I said, at the time it was Virginia, had not become West Virginia yet, which I think happens right before the Civil War, or right after the Civil War, they split off. But Springfield Armory is the big deal in Springfield. And you can go visit it. It's a national historic park site. They're having a ode to Henry Knox with his noble carriage, his noble dragging the cannons from Ticonderoga. They're doing a lot of stuff there. It's a very interesting place to visit. And it also was the target of this rebellion in around 1787 named the Shays Rebellion. And the reason I bring that up is it's the only part in this presentation where I will talk a little bit about stuff I find very interesting, but didn't find a lot of reference to, because I find it interesting that John Brown spends time 4 or 5 years in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the location for the other U.S. Armory, and then tries to take the U.S. Army in Harpers Ferry. And you wonder, is there any kind of cross-pollination there? I haven't found any reference to that, but it is kind of interesting because the Shays Rebellion happens in 1787. It's a complicated thing. It has to do with lack of payment from people who were in the Revolutionary War Army, a lot of debts that were happening, and farmers who were feeling they were being kind of oppressed by the moneyed class and they were losing their property. And they basically took up arms and attempted to take over the Springfield Armory to launch an insurrection. And the reason it's kind of interesting is it really is touted by historians as one of the major things that really gets the U.S. Constitutional Convention into being. Because at the point, we were under the Articles of Confederation, which is how we've been ruled during the Revolution, which is basically one state, one colony, one vote. and it wasn't a very strong federal government at all. This happens, this gets George Washington's attention and a lot of the founding fathers, and they're like, oh, we need to have something more robust in the Articles of Confederation. So it kind of kicks off that whole effort, which results in the Constitutional Convention that happens in Philadelphia. So it is kind of interesting. It is kind of interesting today, too. This is Springfield down here, and this is Holyoke, which we'll see some things up here. But there's this road here, 202, which is called the Daniel Shays Highway. So when you drive it down and drive it in the fall, it is absolutely beautiful road. But it is called the Daniel Shays Highway. So his name still is out there right near the Quabbin Reservoir, which I have talked about in previous presentations, but it is a beautiful part in central Massachusetts. But when you see that sign, and they still are referencing Daniel Shays here a couple hundred years later. So Springfield is also noted as the birthplace of Dr. Seuss. I will argue this is probably the only presentation where you see John Brown and Dr. Seuss talked about it in the same presentation, but there is a bunch of museums in Springfield that are all co-located together in one area. It's about 5 of them, I believe. And it is fascinating because there's a Dr. Seuss museum, there's a science museum, there's 2 art museums, and there's a museum of Springfield history. And that is the one we're going to take a look at. And they do have a display in the second floor there of John Brown. Like I said, he was in Springfield for about 4 or 5 years. He kind of went back and forth among different areas, but he was operating in Springfield around 1846 to 1850. They have his actual table here he used as far as trying to get this whole wool trade going. I do believe during this time he actually goes to England and tries to do arbitrage with wool, basically feeling he's not getting the appropriate money for the wool in the United States. So he's going to go over to England and bring this U.S. wool there, and they're going to pay him a much higher amount than they do in the United States. And that does not happen. He actually ends up getting a lot lower amount, and this is the thing that did almost bankrupt his benefactor there in Ohio. So once again, kind of keeping on the not the great businessman sense, but they do have an exhibit here in the second floor of the Springfield History Museum, which is really, really interesting. And highly recommend if you have a chance to get out there. It's quite interesting. So the other thing that kind of comes in, which plays into a lot of what happens with, quite frankly, the whole abolition movement in the United States, is the Fugitive Slave Act gets passed in 1850. And up until that point, it was basically, slave states were the South, free states were north of the Mason-Dixon line. If you can escape from the South into the North, you were kind of free. So the Underground Railroad is operating. It is basically ferrying slaves north of the Mason-Dixon line so they can reach their freedom. Fugitive Slave Act changes that. Fugitive Slave Act basically says that it is a duty of every U.S. citizen to return a slave to their original owner. And it gets really, really problematic because there's no jury trial. The accused cannot testify. There's this thing where free blacks are actually at risk because the claimant sworn testimony is sufficient proof. So you can say, it's a very generic descriptions are used for, escaped slaves, 20-year-old male, 5'8", heavy set. And they can use that and say, okay, that's my guy. And he may or may not be actually the person. They can actually be brought into slavery. So this is the thing that kind of really energizes the abolition movement. So the abolition movement, we'll get into that when we get before Bleeding Kansas. But, that's out there. It does begin in Boston, pretty much. William Lloyd Garrison, who publishes the paper The Liberator in Boston. He's the one who kind of kicks off this whole abolition as a movement, but it really picks up steam with this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So he's in Springfield, and he starts this group called the League of Gileadites. And Gilead is a biblical reference. The thing about John Brown that does make him different in a lot of ways with other abolitionists, he didn't just believe in abolition of slavery. He believed in the equality of the African American, which may sound like you're kind of splitting hairs with regards to terminology and stuff, but not really. Because you could argue, Abraham Lincoln, when he gets elected president, he is not getting elected for abolition. He is getting elected for not expanding slavery. Those are 2 very different things. He does change as the war goes on. He does, evolve his views on that. Brown really does put his money where his mouth is. And so he actually is a member. He's not a hugely religious, formally religious guy, hugely religious with his own self, can quote the Bible like lock, stock, and barrel. But he formally does not go to many churches. He does go to this church in Springfield, which is a primarily African-American congregation. And that is, once again, pretty radical for, the 1840s. That church had since dissolved, but it did move. And they actually named it St. John's Congregational Church in honor of John Brown. And this is actually the back of a stained glass window that is in the church that is dedicated to John Brown. Unfortunately, I could not get in the church the day I was there, although it was a Sunday. But it was in the afternoon and there was nobody around. But this church is still there. And I said it was named really based on John Brown. So this League of Gileadites really gets energized with the Fugitive Slave Act. So he organizes both abolitionists and free blacks in Springfield to resist this Fugitive Slave Act. And today, this is a mural, which Holyoke is like 4 or 5 miles north of Springfield. And on the back of a building there is this mural that was painted actually in 2023 by Case McLean, artist. And that's a picture of John Brown. And this verbiage here to the left is what they used on the website to explain like what the purpose was that they're putting this mural of John Brown up, which once again, these are the kind of fascinating things I find when you go looking for John Brown and you see these current references. So this is put up basically 3 years ago. And, this is what their interpretation is of John Brown's legacy. And, once again, this is not, history from 150 years ago. This is something that is there currently today. And it's pretty powerful. So with that, we will get into Bleeding Kansas. And I know Lisa had said I'd stop here at any break. So any questions that have popped up?
Yes, Bruce, just one question. It says, aside from his strong faith in Calvinism and his belief that he was an agent of God, was there an event or person that he engaged with early on to work on abolishing slavery?
Good question. So the way I understand it is what kind of gave him his aha moment was he was in Ohio, and I believe he was a young, I was saying he was 12 or 13 years old, and he was somewhere with his father, and he witnessed the beating of a slave. And that is what people tag as kind of his conversion, his road to Damascus, event, for lack of a better term, that really got him evangelized with abolition. And like I said, his father was very much an abolitionist, anti-slavery. And, once again, they had come from this kind of rabid sect in Connecticut, moving to Western Reserve in Ohio, that was very much pro-abolition, which one, is not necessarily widespread in that area. But there was this one moment where he actually witnessed the beating of a slave. And that was just kind of like, okay, this is just nuts. So that's what gets tagged as his becoming a really all in as far as abolition goes.
Thank you. That's the only question so far.
Okay, good. So we'll get to Bleeding Kansas. And this is where the rubber meets the road as far as Mr. Brown, his legacy, and a lot of the complications that happen. It is in basically eastern Kansas. The interesting thing about going to Kansas is here in the north, people ask me, why are you going to Kansas? And we get to Kansas and people find out you're from like Boston. They're like, why are you here? Which I thought was kind of interesting. I will admit our original genesis for going here was we were going to visit some presidential libraries. We were visiting the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, and the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. We were going to go to the Hoover Library in Iowa, but that's actually closed for renovation until this summer. So I won't talk too much about those, except to say they are fascinating places. Also, because obviously Eisenhower follows Truman, so it's really interesting to go to both those libraries within the same trip. Highly recommend going them. They're very well done. The Truman Library just did reopen, I think last year or late 2024 after a big redo. So it's really well done. And the Eisenhower one, I think, is relatively recent, extremely well done. Really, really interesting stuff. So, but I figured while we're out in Kansas, let's take a look at some John Brown locations. This is my picture that I use as my kind of generic Kansas picture. So you have some cows, you have some wind turbines. It is very flat, at least that part of eastern Kansas. I guess I should get into western Kansas where you get toward the Colorado border. It's actually got some pretty interesting topography, but it was a very interesting place to visit. And we had a great time out there and learned an awful lot. So, kind of piggybacking off the whole Fugitive Slave Act, this is a timeline of what you're talking about in the 1850s, basically as the United States goes towards war. And the Compromise of 1850 includes the Fugitive Slave Act. So you have that starting the decade. Then you have Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which once again is not great literature. She is actually from Hartford, Connecticut, just a few miles east of where Mr. Brown was born. So you do have a very anti-slavery sentiment in Connecticut, but this thing sells like crazy, like second to the Bible. This is an incredibly, incredibly, particularly for that day. It's um, an amazingly impactful book as far as the subject matter. Like I said, you read it today and it seems kind of overwrought, but in its time, it was incredibly influential. Then you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And once again, this is a way to kind of kick the can down the road as far as slavery going. And they're going to open up the Kansas-Nebraska territories to settlement. And the big debate is, in order to kind of maintain balance, is which is a slave state, which is a free state. So our friend Stephen Douglas, who is actually the person who debates uh, Lincoln in the 1857, I think, the senatorial race in Illinois, very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, he's the one that comes up with the term sovereignty. And his concept is free or slave should be defined, decided by the residents of the territories. So once again, one of those great things of might sound great in theory, becomes really problematic as both sides flood these territories to try and skew the vote toward either, free state, abolitionists are coming, or slave state, the border ruffians are coming over from Missouri, which is a slave state, came in as a slave state in the Compromise of 1820, where Missouri comes in and Massachusetts has to carve off Maine, and Maine becomes a state in 1820 because of the Missouri Compromise to keep that balance of slave versus free states. Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of ups it. It also breaks the Missouri Compromise because the Missouri Compromise is saying there is no slavery above parallel 36, 30 degrees, I believe. Um, and both Kansas and Nebraska are above that. So it kind of blows up that compromise, starts everything anew, creates an incredible amount of tension, and that's where Mr. Brown goes right into the mix. Another thing that happens is the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, is beaten nearly to death on the floor, I think, of the House of Representatives by Preston Brooks, who I think is the brother or brother-in-law of the senator, who felt that Sumner is a very, very ardent abolitionist, had offended him in some abolition speech. So he beats him nearly to death. And actually, Sumner never really recovers. He doesn't get back into the Senate, I think, till like 1859. And then there's the Dred Scott decision, which basically says slaves are not citizens; they have no rights. You have the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois. That's when we're at 1858. You have John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, and then you have Lincoln elected president in November of 1860, which begins secession, which happens in 1861. So that is one slide that shows you our slide towards Civil War. There's an interesting kind of first person book that was written about Kansas. There was an Englishman who came, Gladstone, who was actually the brother of the very famous prime minister, later prime minister of England, Gladstone. He actually travels to Kansas and writes about it. And the interesting part about this is the person who publishes is Frederick Law Olmsted. And of course, Frederick Law Olmsted is the father of landscape architecture here in America. He's actually going to be the subject of my next speech or my next presentation. I won't call it a speech in March. I'll get to him a little bit later because there are actually some bleed overs. I mean, I don't think John Brown and Olmsted ever met, but actually a lot of stuff that's happening in Kansas and in the South pre-Civil War, they're both in that space very heavily. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. So going on the ground, Kansas City, Kansas, not to be considered confused with Kansas City, Missouri. Kansas City, Kansas, which I believe is now going to get the stadium where the Chiefs are going to reside. So Arrowhead Stadium is being vacated. And the Chiefs are moving from Missouri to Kansas. So they do have a statue to Mr. Brown there. We were there on a rainy Easter Sunday last year. And the interesting part is you go around and you see these references to John Brown. And so this is erected by the people. And there was I believe there was some sort of college, Western University, which is an African American college in the area. They celebrate the legacy of John Brown and a couple of other things. Quindaro, Kansas was another settlement there. And this was put up around 1943, I believe, was the actual statue. But It is there today, and I have to admit, not a lot around it. So it's kind of this field. You can see behind it, kind of a field, and there's a statue to John Brown. So moving to the capital of Kansas, which is Topeka, which is a beautiful little town and a beautiful capital. Even though I've lived in a couple of capitals in my life, I think, only actually been in the Massachusetts capital. But we got into the Topeka capital of Kansas, and it is an absolutely beautiful building. This was a group that was getting a tour of the legislative chambers. These copper rails and posts here for the stairway. Just, most state capitals are beautiful. This is no exception. And there are exhibits to Mr. Brown in the basement. Interesting story about the basement. It had to be redone because I believe they used limestone. One of the stones they used wasn't really great for holding up the structure, so they had to like rebuild it again. So they had these massive, massive blocks, and they have an exhibit of John Brown, Osawatomie, which we'll get to. The whole thing with bleeding Kansas and will it be a free or slave state. And we'll also get to the fact that this was a very interesting thing they decided to display, was a sword that belonged, to John Brown in his time in Kansas. And we will get to a situation where that is a little interesting choice that you want to show that. But the most famous thing related to John Brown in the Capitol in Topeka is the mural, which was the source of Kansas's first album cover called Tragic Prelude. It is installed in 1942 by the artist John Stewart Curry. This is what most people see from that. What is interesting is it is actually a much larger mural, and it goes, here to the right across and shows actually some sort of conquistadors in the West. But this is the main drag here, and you have the Confederate and the Union side. You have soldiers that are dead here, and you have John Brown holding the Bible in one hand and a rifle in the next. And it's a very dramatic, and you would say, kind of over the top depiction as you read about John Brown. He also was very literate. I mean, he didn't go to college. He had very limited formal schooling, but one of the more interesting things about him is he's a very dynamic speaker. He's a very dynamic writer, which we'll get to as to how that also has a lot to do with his legacy. This is actually, in at least what I've read about and all the stuff I've been able to come across, a fairly good depiction of Mr. Brown. Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. That does kind of sum up John Brown in a lot of ways. So the one place we didn't go to, I forgot to mention that all these photographs, except for historical photographs in this presentation, are mine, except for two. And this is one of them. So this is just something I grabbed off the web. This is the infamous Potawatomi Massacre. And so this happens in 1856, and John Brown, basically one of his sons, John Jr., I believe, actually ends up out in Kansas, migrating from Ohio. He's trying to farm out in Kansas, gets involved in some of the abolition stuff, reaches out to his father and says, a lot of stuff going on here. You might want to come out. So John Brown actually is in the Adirondacks, comes out to Kansas to get involved. Like I said, the border ruffians, there are pro-slavery factions coming over trying to, in a lot of ways, they were really, illegally voting in various elections to get Kansas to be pro-slavery. So he is involved. He's not involved. He basically directs what's known as the Potawatomi Massacre, and it's a pretty brutal thing. And when everybody talks about John Brown and talks about the pros and cons and the complication of it, this is one of the defining moments where basically there's a couple of households of pro-slavery people. A lot of things have been going back and forth. Like I said, this is right around the time. It was right after Charles Sumner is almost caned to death on the floor of the of Congress, and the town of Lawrence, which we'll get to, is sacked by pro-slavery forces. I don't believe too many, if any, people are killed, but they actually burn the town. So he is enraged by these acts, and he takes it upon himself with a band of like 5 or 6 people, a couple of which are his sons, and they go to Potawatomi and basically drag out of their house in front of their family these pro-slavery people and execute them with swords in the road. And the reason I've mentioned those swords, that sword that was in the Topeka Capitol, so Brown himself does not actually do the execution. He tells the people to do it, but they use broadswords. The reason is they didn't want gunshots that would potentially alert other victims they were going to have. So it becomes kind of this notorious thing, the Potawatomi Massacre. And he gives different explanations for it. His kind of explanation of it evolves over the last, he's only alive for 3 more years, and how he explains it gets a little squishy. Sometimes he takes kind of full responsibility. Sometimes he kind of, pushes it off. But when you do talk about John Brown, the Potawatomi Massacre is something that certainly has to come up. What I found was there wasn't really anything there except this particular sign. So we had to make some decisions about where we're going to go, and I decided to go to a place that was a little bit more representative of his stuff and had a lot more to photograph. But in the meantime, this is a statue of Charles Sumner, which is on the public garden in Boston. And like I said, he was beaten in Congress in 1856. His house actually is still on the backside of Beacon Hill at 20 Hancock Street. He was an interesting character in and of himself. And like I said, he was a real deal as far as being abolition, but he basically pretty much paid for it with mostly with his life, because he was not really the same after that. I think he did live until after the Civil War, but he was severely damaged by getting beaten with the cane. And as I mentioned, Lawrence is a big event with happens in Kansas. It gets sacked by the pro-slavery forces. And John Brown actually does end up later on in Kansas, in Lawrence, and he is doing Underground Railroad work where they're ferrying people. This is a map that's actually at the site in Kansas, the Grover Barn, which is used as an underground station, and they ferry the people across and put them actually going across from Detroit into Ontario, Canada, to get them to freedom. And once again, this is you have to do this because of the Futures of Slave Act, where you got to get them out of the United States, because Futures of Slave Act says anybody needs to return slaves to their owners. So what do people know Lawrence, Kansas for? University of Kansas. Go Jayhawks. So they're building a brand new football stadium, which I think now is complete. But it is a pretty campus, and Lawrence is certainly a college town, and not a cheap town. I was kind of surprised that coming from the East, I was under the impression that everything in Kansas would be cheap, and that was not the case for Lawrence. But it is a beautiful college town, and we had a very nice hotel room that had a very interesting overlook that you could see the town. And so this was the football stadium they were building. We also ended up visiting down in southeastern Connecticut, in southeastern Kansas. We visited one of Lisa's friends from high school. Hello, Kevin and Fran, if you're watching. And they're huge UK. Kevin went to actually, I think, both the law school and a graduate there. Huge fans of that. And the Rock Chalk is like their slogan that they yell. And this was being built into the football stadium. Obviously, basketball is a bigger deal there than football, but we can't see the inside of a basketball stadium from our veranda. So, as I mentioned, this is what he's doing. He is ferrying people on the Underground Railroad, and once again, he's very much involved in what's going on there. So he is a man of action. Oh, there we go. That's the actual. Let's see. That is the Grover's Barn here, which still stands there in Lawrence. But the place that gets associated with Brown the most, and it's by his own definition, is Osawatomie. So he actually, after this event in Osawatomie, he starts referring to himself as Osawatomie John Brown. So kind of we had the choice to go to Potawatomi or Osawatomie. And there's much more in Osawatomie about John Brown. There's actually a state park. So there is the John Brown State Park of Osawatomie. They claim where the Civil War started, which might be a bit of an overreach, but they have a statue here that was erected in 1835. This is the park. It is absolutely gorgeous. I won't say there's a lot more in Osawatomie than the park, and it is kind of out of the way, so we wouldn't typically go there, but it was interesting to visit. And this building here we'll get to is the Adair Cabin. And so basically when he was in Osawatomie, he was staying in this farmhouse, which as we get to North Elba is kind of similar. These wood frame farmhouses from the mid 1800s. And he was staying there. And so what they did is they moved the farmhouse to the location where this quote unquote Battle of Osawatomie happened, and they enclosed it in a museum. And so the Battle of Osawatomie is where he and a small band of his followers, a lot of them are his sons. Like I mentioned at the beginning, he had 20 children by 2 different wives, 11 of which survive into childhood, and 3 of them get killed in this whole Bleeding Kansas thing. So he is actually, one of the few people who was giving a resistance to the pro-slavery unit. And actually, he has to retreat from this. It's not just any kind of astounding victory, but the fact that he was able to actually, do some resistance against the pro-slavery stuff kind of got mythologized. And like I said, he embraced this, I am Osawatomie John Brown. And it wasn't like this amazingly incredible military victory. He said he had to retreat across the creek and had to disperse and stuff like that, but it becomes kind of more mythical than it does in the actual reality. But this is the actual building that houses his house encased in that, kind of a classic little kitschy Midwest type of thing with the big chair in the park. And that's the actual, you can see here, that's the exterior, the um, I think it is limestone exterior with the actual cabin there. And then where the cabin actually was, so they had moved it from a different location to the location where the battle was. And this is a schematic they put up to show where the actual cabin was, kind of across the other side of town of Osawatomie. So this is definitely getting into the weeds of John Brown, but this kind of an interesting little, quasi sculpture referencing the actual location of where his cabin was in Osawatomie. So with that, we'll get into the Secret Six. Lisa, I guess a quick break if we have any questions.
No, people have been putting some comments in chat, which is great. We appreciate it. But I don't have anything in the actual Q&A box. So if people do have want to have Bruce answer questions, just be sure and put those in Q&A, and we'll get those at the next break.
Okay. So the Secret Six are six gentlemen who basically provide kind of philosophical and financial backing to John Brown. So he goes into Kansas, he's basically involved in this war against slavery. It's all this talk has been happening, all this stuff's been going on from basically, the beginning of the United States to 1850. Fugitive Slave Act happens, Kansas-Nebraska Act happens. On the ground in Kansas is where things are happening. So he actually now goes back east to try and raise funds because he needs to arm the people. Now everybody's got the Sharps rifles, which are called Beecher Bibles, after Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, very famous preacher who was a staunch abolitionist, and the Sharps rifles become known as Beecher's Bibles. So a lot of people are anti-slavery or getting themselves armed. He wants to get some funding to arm his folks out in Kansas, and these six people are kind of behind him, and they're all based out here in the East. Theodore Parker is probably the most vocal. He is a transcendentalist. Unfortunately, he is dying of tuberculosis. So when a lot of this stuff starts to happen at the end of the 1850s, he's actually over in Italy trying to, the big thing with tuberculosis obviously was, change the environment, get out in the fresh air, this kind of stuff. So he ends up going to Florence, I think Florence, ends up dying in Italy in 1860. But he is born in Lexington, Mass, dies in Florence. And he goes from Harvard Divinity School, but he couldn't go undergraduate because of funding. So back in those days, you didn't have to have one after the other. And he runs his Unitarian church in what is now West Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is a part of Boston in the 1830s, 1840s. His most famous quote is basically what MLK, this is how you see the genius of MLK. He takes this rather tongue-twisting quote from Parker and says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So that originates from this quote from Theodore Parker. So like I said, he's a Unitarian minister, so he's not providing a lot of financial backing, but he is providing a lot of philosophical backing, and he writes a lot, and he is very animated, very controversial because he's not shy about sharing his views. His church is still there today. A friend of mine's wife, Rich Higgins, was the pastor. Her father actually was the pastor there for a while. Is there today with a statue of Mr. Parker in the front, and it is called the Theodore Parker Unitarian Church in West Roxbury. Franklin the Sanborn's another member of the Secret Six. He's a school teacher. Once again, he himself's not providing a ton of money, but he is facilitating a lot of stuff. He's one of these interesting characters you come across in history that's kind of tied into a lot of things. He's very good friends with Henry David Thoreau. He ends up writing biographies of John Brown, Thoreau. I believe he writes a biography of Emerson. So he's very much plugged into the transcendentalist community in Concord, Massachusetts, which once again is a very, very fervent area for John Brown as far as both finances and philosophical underpinnings for his war against slavery. So Sanborn is buried in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which is in Concord, which is most famous for Author's Ridge, where people like Louisa May Alcott, Thoreau, Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, they are all buried in that cemetery. Probably the most interesting Secret Six guy is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He is buried in Cambridge Cemetery, which is next to Mount Auburn, but not Mount Auburn. And he's based in Worcester. And so he's a very, very famous, rich person who is extremely anti-slavery. He actually ends up raising a all-black regiment during the Civil War. Of the Secret Six, when John Brown is captured after Harpers Ferry, most of the Secret Six get out of Dodge. By getting out of Dodge, I mean they get out of the United States. I know Sanborn goes to Canada. A couple go to Canada. One admits himself to an insane asylum. Higginson stays in Worcester and basically says, "Come get me if you want to get me," and they don't. But he's an interesting character in the fact that he actually is a mentor to Emily Dickinson. And so there's this book, I haven't read it, but it was a very well-received book a few years back called White Heat, which talks about the friendship between Dickinson and Higginson. So in the mid 1800s in America, it's not a huge population. You do find a lot of these cross currents where people are running into each other. They're meeting people in different settings and stuff like that. It is fascinating when you go into this space and see how much cross-pollination there is among these various characters that you kind of consider these icons of American history, and a lot of them are overlapping, and we'll see that a bit with Olmsted. So Mount Auburn Cemetery, as I've talked about in previous presentations, is the first garden cemetery in the United States, created on the Watertown-Cambridge line in 1837. Phenomenal place. As a photographer, I've been there many, many, many times. It's just an amazing place. This is actually outside the Washington Tower there, and get a view of the skyline of Boston. Another Secret Six is George Luther Stearns. He's the only Secret Six where on his tombstone he actually mentions John Brown. So he does not shy away from John Brown at all. So he is one of the financial backers of Mr. Brown. And he has a nice spread here with his family and stuff in Mount Auburn. Also in Mount Auburn is Julia Ward Howe, who we met at the beginning, who does the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but her husband, Samuel Gridley Howe, is actually one of the Secret Six. And they live in Beacon Hill in Boston. And when John Brown comes to Boston he did a couple of fundraising tours in the late 1850s, he does stay with them. And so he had a direct, he knew these people, so she writes the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is, based on the tune that is John Brown's body. And Samuel Gridley Howe does provide financial and philosophical backing for Brown. And the big financial backing is a guy named Garrett Smith, and we'll come to him in Timbuktu, which is in North Elba. That's the reason John Brown goes to the Adirondacks. It's, once again, I grew up in Albany, had no idea John Brown's base of operation for the last 10 years of his life was in the Adirondacks. Knocked me over with a feather. I had no idea that was the case. The reason is Garrett Smith, his father, I believe, was in business with John Jacob Astor. So he becomes filthy rich, inherits some money from his father. He is a very, very virulent anti-slavery abolitionist. And so he wants to create this kind of utopian community in the Adirondacks with freed black families being farmers. And he attracts John Brown to go there basically as kind of a free place to live, and also, since John Brown has experience with farming, to help them become farmers. Doesn't become that successful because most of these people are urban people, and you put them in the Adirondacks and have them grow stuff. Did you spend any time in the Adirondacks? I was going to check what the temperature in Lake Placid was today, but I know just a few weeks ago it was like minus 15 or 20. Pretty harsh environment. So it wasn't the greatest place to do that, but he is able to get this utopian community there in the 1850s and convince John Brown to come there. This was actually a picture. I was there this fall, and they were having a blues concert there. And they had an actual exhibition called Dreaming of Timbuktu, and Timbuktu was the name of this utopian community, quasi-utopian community of freed African-American farmers. This is not part of the Secret Six, but these are people who were actually very much in the abolitionist movement. I mentioned William Lloyd Garrison before, statue of him in the Commonwealth Mall in Boston. He is kind of the the forefather of abolition in America, publishes the paper The Liberator. Very, very staunch abolitionist. I guess in person he was this very meek guy with glasses, but he really was the real deal. He and John Brown did disagree a lot on methods. William Lloyd Garrison was not for violence. His argument was if you do it violently, you're going to spend the next 90 years trying to unwind it. John Brown was more, like I said, a man of action. You can do the counterfactual as far as history goes. I'm not sure that Garrison was wrong, but it's a complicated situation. And then the other abolitionist that's remembered on the public garden in Boston is Wendell Phillips. And this was erected in 1915. He's the one who actually, when John Brown was hanged after Harpers Ferry, he was arguing for him to be buried in Mount Auburn, but his wife wanted him brought back to North Elba. And Harriet Tubman has a statue down on Columbus Ave in Boston. John Brown interacted with her, called her the General. And he was trying to get these people involved in Harper's Ferry. Doesn't really come to fruition, but her statue is the first statue of a woman on city-owned property in Boston, erected in 1999. And this is a map of the Underground Railroad in the Northeast going up toward Canada. So, like I said, John Brown goes east to try and raise money and awareness for his efforts in Kansas, and he does speaking engagements all over the place. He goes to Concord actually twice and speaks in what is the Concord Town Hall. It's officially called the Townhouse, and it was built, I think, like in 1855. So this was not here during the Lexington, Concord, North Bridge stuff in 1775. It's built in the middle of the 1800s, but it is a place for public speaking. Thoreau speaks there a lot. Emerson speaks there a lot. I was there, I mentioned before, I do volunteer with the National Historical Park at Concord, and I had some time to kill before my shift started. So I wandered over here and said, I wonder what's inside of this place. I've taken pictures on the outside. I wonder if there's a room that maybe these guys spoke in. And lo and behold, there is. So I wandered upstairs, and this is still being used today, very much in great shape. But this is the upstairs auditorium as it is in the townhouse/hall in Concord that is still used today. And this is where people like Emerson, Thoreau, and John Brown spoke. So with that, we'll do a quick transition. Lisa, if you have any other questions before we dive into Harper's Ferry.
Yes, Bruce, we have two. First of all, were the Secret Six known to each other or only to Brown? And how do we know about them? Did they write? Did some confess?
It's an interesting question. I think the Secret Six, in some ways, is a manufacturing after the fact. Some of them knew each other. I don't think some of them did. And it wasn't really a formal, like we had meeting at the group of the Secret Six, and we're going to meet in the secret location and stuff like that. That really didn't happen. Of course, a lot of them disavowed knowledge of John Brown when he got captured at Harper's Ferry, as did John Brown. There were some writings, but as you can imagine, this is true with Thoreau, actually. He was very much involved in the Underground Railroad, but he doesn't write a lot about it. And of course, the fugitive slave law, you can see that. So they were kind of circumspect as to what actually went on and who was doing what and how much they were influenced. And like I said, when Brown gets captured in 1859, these people scatter because they are concerned about, what their relationship is. It's a little bit hard to trace sometimes, the paper trail and stuff like that. But Franklin Sanborn was really a traffic cop. He was very much involved in kind of getting communications from Brown and working with other people. And most of them were in and around Boston, although Gerrit Smith was out in central New York. He's actually buried around Syracuse, I think.
And one more question, Bruce, and maybe you'll answer this one in your next section, but the question is, if John Brown had the backing of these rich people, why was this Harper's Ferry group so small in number? So I know what's coming next. So
yeah, we'll kind of get to that. It's
okay.
Harper's Ferry is a complicated story, which we'll talk about. So we'll talk about North Elba and Harper's Ferry. So first talk about North Elba. So here is North Elba, up here in the gut of the Adirondacks. And, like I said, Gerrit Smith convinces him to come up here in 1850. And he's kind of splitting his time between Springfield down over here, right there, the edge of Springfield. It's actually Greenfield. Springfield's a bit farther south, but up here to North Elba. So he's kind of bouncing around. But he is in North Elba. And almost immediately when he gets to North Elba, he does end up going out to Kansas. So one of, if not the unsung hero heroine in this whole story is his wife Mary. So he is constantly all over the place doing his stuff, and he's got all these kids. A lot of them are young. He does have some of his sons with him who are in his party, but there are a lot of young children, young girls that have to be taken care of, and he puts them up into the Adirondacks. And actually, at his space in the Adirondacks, they have a garden that is Mary's garden. And I believe there have been some books written about the brown women, but what they had to deal with while he's off, doing his thing is pretty harsh. It was a very, very tough environment. So this is his farm there. Some infrared pictures, which come out a bit dark in PowerPoint, but beautiful place. It's there today, and they were having an event there. Like I said, when I was there that afternoon, they were having a blues concert in the barn in the back. Those are a color picture, and as you look here and look to the right, you see this. So the thing is, what is North Elba most famous for? And North Elba is most famous for because it is the town with the village of Lake Placid in it. So Lake Placid is the host of the 1932 and the 1980s Winter Olympics. This is a ski jump, one of only two ski jumps, I believe, in the United States that are used for training by the Olympics. There's one in Utah, and there's one here. And you can go to it, take a look at it, and understand why you would probably never do that yourself. And you can also take a elevator to the top and look out. And this is actually John Brown's farm. And there's a tent there. This is the kind of circular drive there with the statue of John Brown. And this is the farmhouse here. And these are the Adirondacks. And here, I mean, and he loved it. He did love the Adirondacks. One of the famous novels written about John Brown is called Cloud Splitter, which references Mount Marcy, which is the highest mountain in the Adirondacks. And he really loved the Adirondack topography in the area. Unfortunately, he was off doing a lot of other stuff and didn't spend a ton of time there. Also, it is the home to the Herb Brooks Arena, where the very famous Miracle on Ice happened in 1980, and they still have skaters there today. So it is a pretty fascinating juxtaposition of being able to go to Lake Placid and the farm at North Elba. I had never been to Lake Placid before, even though I grew up only about 2 hours south of it. And it is a very charming, beautiful town in the Adirondacks. Can't speak for it now. Well, if you're into winter sports, obviously a great place, but it does get super cold there in the winter. So this is the inside of his farm there, and not unlike the one he was in Osawatomie. Very similar to how these things are constructed in the 1850s. Once again, try to think about living in a place like this where it's 20, 30 below in the winter. And this is a statue out front. I said that's one of the farmhouse there, and this is where his grave is actually there. And this is the grave of John Brown. This is where John Brown's body lies a molding. So there's this huge, huge granite, natural, glacial erratic or something that was left here. And a lot of people who were killed, I think it's two of his sons who were killed at Harpers Ferry were brought back here. And there's some other people brought here. But this is, the very famous where John Brown is buried. And it is in North Elba, New York. So going to Harpers Ferry, we did a kind of a classic Griswold family vacation, driving down during April vacation from Boston or from Chelmsford down to the Great Smoky Mountains in a whirlwind 1-week trip, going through a bunch of national park and national park adjacent places: Shenandoah, Blue Ridge, Great Smoky Mountains, Antietam, and Harpers Ferry. So this is Antietam quickly. Bloody Lane, Burnside Bridge. A very, very, the Civil War battlefields, I think, are fascinating to go to. Once again, as you see what I kind of understand what actually happened, they are pretty horrific, but they're very, very, bucolic places now. And this is outside the town of Sharpsburg. So the South called the Battle of Sharpsburg, and the North calls them based on the river. And this is the Antietam Creek. But our main goal here is Harpers Ferry. So Harpers Ferry, as you can see, is right on the cusp here of Virginia, Maryland, and what is today West Virginia. So this was all part of Virginia at the time this happens in 1859. And it is the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac River. And as a result, it floods tremendously. So really nobody lives in Harpers Ferry anymore. The town flooded so much that they basically stopped trying to make it livable, although they do have, as we'll see, some buildings that are still there. But this is actually this is a bridge that I guess has washed out at some point, but you can see the current and stuff like that. There's a lot of water moving around here. And, with the mountains and all this other kind of Appalachian mountains and everything else pouring in, they're very, very prone to flooding. The day we were there, it was raining. So it wasn't the greatest day to be in Harpers Ferry, but this is what's there. That's kind of the, remnants of what the village looked like, and it's kept up by the National Park Service today. They have a nice museum there. I will say it was kind of interesting that when you watch the intro video, there is not one mention of John Brown, which I found kind of odd. But when you go into the actual museum itself, there is a lot about John Brown, and they do a lot of, a lot of the context setting that I did at the beginning is stuff that they're doing to, set the stage for this raid that John Brown has onto Harper's Ferry to try and get the armaments that are in the arsenal in Harper's Ferry. So, quickly, I know we're kind of hitting the after 8 o'clock here, but he his theory is that he wants to incite a slave revolt. So he believes that with a small army, he can go down, capture these weapons, arm slaves, and it'll be kind of this domino effect where just slaves will all of a sudden start flooding in. He can arm them with guns or with pikes. He can use his knowledge and advantage of the hills and the mountains to be able to tactically outmaneuver these militias and the army that are going on. And he can basically kind of create this guerrilla warfare that will, what his thought process is, it'll make having slaves such an encumbrance that the slave owners will basically at that point kind of say, all right, we're done with this. It's kind of a crazy plan to a certain degree. Somebody asked about why there were so few people, because I think a lot of people heard that plan, and he's selling to people like Frederick Douglass, like Harriet Tubman. So the interesting thing is John Brown is not this fringe figure. He is right in the middle with these very, very iconic people from history. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson. They know John Brown, and none of them really get behind his effort. So he ends up with a band of, like, I think 21 men who are going to incite this. And, he takes over the town. They cut the telegraph wires. They stay in this house, which I didn't get a chance to go to because we weren't in Harpers Ferry that long. It's called Kennedy House, I believe. They lived for like a month in the second floor of the house and tried to remain like innocuous so they wouldn't be known. And you can imagine 20 men living up there trying to like hide themselves before they were going. Oh, they weren't really, nobody really discovered them. And Harper's Ferry becomes becomes a disaster as the local militia come in. A lot of alcohol is consumed. A lot of people are shooting each other. People are getting killed. John Brown's people are getting killed. A couple of them go out with a white flag. One of them's his son. They're gunned down. And then eventually, and this is one of these weird confluences of history, and I'll say move through these slides here. These are different comments about John Brown, and in his time, once again, this is an incredibly well-known thing that happens. This is a huge, huge deal when it happens, and so he ends up, and this is the other photograph in this presentation that's not mine because I did not get a great photograph of the engine house. My good friend, New Hampshire photographer Gary Tompkins, was there last year, and he's a master, actually, film black and white photographer. And so he had this picture of the engine house, which I asked if I could use because it's a great picture of it. And so he's basically holed up in this engine house with his ragtag group, and the government army from Washington, D.C. is deployed. And you saw from the map previously, Harper's Ferry is not that far from D.C. So they come, and of course, they are led by Colonel Robert E. Lee. And one of his officers is Jeb Stuart, another famous soon-to-be Civil War general. Jeb Stuart is the one who goes to the engine house to negotiate with John Brown if he's going to surrender. John Brown says, "No, I'm not." And Jeb Stuart said, "Well, sorry, but it's not going to end well." And within a matter of 20 minutes, basically most of his party is killed, and Brown is severely wounded. And I think there are 2 or 3 other people who are still alive and are captured. There are some other folks who are out, like his son Owen was actually back at the Kennedy house to guard some of the supplies they had. He's able to find out what's going on and is able to escape and is never caught. He actually ends up living in California, I believe, and he becomes the narrator for Russell Banks's book Cloud Splitter. So this whole thing ends. He is captured, and it becomes this, once again, trial of the century. And he's very quickly tried in the state of Virginia. He's convicted and sentenced to hang all very quickly. So this happens in mid-October. His trial is late October to mid-November, and he's actually hanged, I believe, on December 2nd, I think. So it's only less than 2 months from when the raid fails to when he and his two or three other associates are actually hanged in Charlestown, Charlestown, Virginia, at that point. So, the question of why weren't there more men? He certainly wanted one, and he thought that this plan of his was going to be this amazing plan. And he actually meets with Frederick Douglass in Pennsylvania, I believe, very close before the raid starts. And Douglass says, no, I'm not going to do this. This is crazy. And one of his associates, a guy named Shields Green, excuse me, leaves Frederick Douglass and goes with John Brown and participates in the raid. I believe he survives but is captured and is hanged right around when John Brown does. So Frederick Douglass, they knew what this was happening, and they were like, this is not going to be successful. He called it hive the bees. He was expecting that all these freed slaves would come in and they'd be an army that could be marshaled. And once again, you're talking about people who are rural agricultural people, and all of a sudden they're going to just at the flick of a switch be changed into some sort of army. And it's kind of crazy, which is one of the reasons why you think how the American Revolution was crazy that was successful, because even militia are a lot less than an actual formal army. So that was his plan. It didn't pan out, and he dies. One of the weird things about this story of John Brown is, like I said, how he pops up. So I literally was having a discussion with my neighbor, shout out to Mike O'Connor, up the street in the fall, say I'm doing a presentation on John Brown. He goes, "Oh, do you know what the John Brown Bell in Marlborough, Massachusetts?" So Marlborough, Massachusetts is basically a half hour from where I'm sitting right now on 495. And sure enough, you go to the town common in Marlborough, Massachusetts, and there is a little tower with "This is John Brown's bell." And John Brown's bell, from what I understand, was the bell that was hanging here. And there were some Massachusetts volunteers in the Civil War who were in Harpers Ferry in 1862, and they confiscated this and brought it back to Massachusetts, where it still stands. I guess the state of West Virginia actually wants it back. But up to this point, it's still in Marlborough. So one of those weird John Brown things that he kind of, once you start looking for him, he pops up everywhere. So with that, I will do a quick legacy and wrap up. Any quick questions, Lisa, I should jump into?
No, not at this time.
Okay. So as I mentioned, he is with the Transcendentalists. They become big fans of his. John Brown is captured and is put on trial. And the first major public figure to come out for John Brown is Henry David Thoreau. So he delivers a speech, which is now known as a plea for Captain John Brown. He gives it, I think, 3 or 4 times. I believe he gives it in Concord. He gives it in Boston. And I think he gives it in Worcester and maybe one other place. But he comes out in support of John Brown. And, people will say, how can Henry David Thoreau, who's noted for civil disobedience, and he's supposedly the patron saint for MLK and Gandhi, who were nonviolent resistors and stuff like that. And he was more complicated than that. And his thing about civil disobedience was you shouldn't obey unjust laws. He himself is not going to take up arms, but he is certainly not going to say other people shouldn't if they really are going against unjust laws. Slavery becomes this, pinnacle of an unjust law, should not follow it. It's getting reinforced by things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Futures Slave and the Dred Scott. So these people are really, really getting energized. He comes out in support of John Brown before he's actually hanged. And John Brown himself, what's his legacy? He says, "I leave it to the impartial tribunal to decide whether the world has been the worse or better of my living and dying in it." So the interesting thing about John Brown is, he gets captured. And so some of these Secret Six want to mount a rescue operation. So they, particularly Higginson, so they want to go down and basically swoop into the jail he's in Charlestown, Virginia, and liberate him. And he doesn't want any part of it because he knows, like I said, he's kind of a master at what was for its time the media. So he's writing letters, he's having things published, he's giving interviews in jail, which is one of the fascinating things about when you look at jails in the 1800s, how many people come in and visit the prisoners and interview them and everything else. It's almost like a turnstile at these places. So he's a very good writer. And he writes these missives and they get published by these newspaper people. And he's very aware that his martyrdom will probably be more effective than, anything he could possibly do. And, there's a debate about whether that was the real goal of Harper's Ferry. I think he knew that was a possibility. I don't think he went in there thinking that was what his ideal outcome was, but he was realizing that could be a, tangential benefit if things really go south on that. So he does become this martyr, as I talked about at the beginning. He becomes the source of this, tune that is ubiquitous during the Civil War. So once again, the cross-pollination of people, thorough. After he dies, he does write another essay about him, says he's not Old Brown any longer. He's an angel of light. I do find it ironic everybody called him Old Brown. He was 59, which is certainly younger than I am. But another kind of weird confluence is at his hanging I believe it was in Charlestown, Virginia. John Wilkes Booth is a member of some organization that is there and witnesses the hanging. So there again, you have the future assassin of Lincoln is actually there watching John Brown get hanged, and he supposedly said, "I looked at the traitor and terrorizer with unlimited, undeniable contempt." So you could see, obviously different sides of the view of that particular event. And this is one of the most famous things that John Brown is quoted for. He actually gave this note to one of the guards on his way to the gallows. He says, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done." He didn't really go to Harper's Ferry to kill a bunch of people. He wanted to do it as easily as possible. He ran into some folks and they had to, once again, once you have a lot of guns around, bad things can start happening. But he wasn't in there for a massive massacre at it. Certainly the slave insurrection would not have been pretty. But, he realized at that point that there was really no point. He was at the point of no return, not to quote Kansas album again. But that's where we're at. And so he was very prophetic in that particular way. And this is kind of how the abolition happens. Obviously, with the Civil War, it takes the Civil War to have the abolition of slavery in all these southern states and in some of these border states. So that is exactly what happens. So as a, kind of a final view of this, Frederick Douglass is an interesting guy. Obviously, very famous, like the most photographed American in the 19th century. And he was there, in 1859, and John Brown's like, "You got to come with me. You're going to help me hive the bees. You're the spokesperson for the African American population." And Douglass backs out. 20, 30 years later, he says, the question is, did John Brown fail? He certainly did fail to get out of Harper's Ferry before being beaten down by United States soldiers. He did fail to save his own life and to lead a liberating army into the mountains of Virginia. But he did not go to Harper's Ferry to save his life. The true question is, did John Brown draw his sword against slavery and thereby lose his life in vain? And to this I answer 10,000 times no. No man fails or can fail who so grandly gives himself and all he has to a righteous cause. No man who in his hour of extremest need, when on his way to meet an ignominious death, could so forget himself as to stop and kiss a little child, one of the hated races for whom he was about to die, could be any possibility fail. Now, this is, like I said, he had the chance, Douglass had the chance at the time to go in, 20, 30 years later. It's a little bit of revisionist history, but, the way things kind of bore out with the Civil War and everything else, there's not really too much doubt that Harper's Ferry certainly is one of the events that led to the Civil War happening sooner rather than later. So with that, tons of resources. Somebody mentioned in the chat about Midnight Rising, which I'll get to in a second, actually. If I had to pick out one, which I think is kind of an interesting read, is the novel, The Good Lord Bird, which came out in 2013 by James McBride. It was made into a miniseries with Ethan Hawke as John Brown on Showtime. The reason I bring it out is it's very well written, and it's actually kind of funny. John Brown does not get associated with humor a lot, for good reason. But this book is so well done. It does use a fictional character who's an escaped slave boy who is mistaken for a girl, and it leads to some kind of comedic things, actually with Frederick Douglass, and some other things, and it's really, really great read. If you're really more into the whole John Brown, I would say Cloud Splitter, which is about a 770-page novel by Russell Banks, who's a fascinating author who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. A really deep dive into that whole space, but there's a lot of nonfiction here as well. The biography in 1970 by Stephen B. Oates, I think it was the Amherst professor, to purge this land with blood is kind of the gold standard for that. But somebody did mention Midnight Rising by Tony Horwitz. Oddly enough, I'm going to be doing a presentation in a couple of months on Frederick Law Olmsted, A Legacy in Landscapes. And Tony Horwitz was kind of my gateway into these two guys. So he wrote a book, Midnight Rising, back in 2012, I believe. Chelmsford has a one book we have every year where we have an author or authors. We choose one book that the whole town reads, and then the author comes and speaks to us. In that year, he is married to Geraldine Brooks, Tony Horwitz was. And they both had books out there. One of them was Confederate in the Attic, which is a classic if you get a chance to read that too, about Civil War reenactors. But they were both kind of on the book tour thing, and they came and spoke to us. Unfortunately, Tony Horwitz died suddenly of a heart problem about 10 years ago, and he was just a fascinating guy. So he writes a book a few years later called Spying on the South, and that's about Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a early correspondent for the New York Daily Times, which becomes the New York Times, and he goes to the South in the 1850s and writes dispatches for the paper under the pseudonym Yeoman. And it's a contemporary account of slavery in the South in the 1870s. Granted, he's born in Connecticut as well, born in Hartford, so he's a northerner looking at it. But it really is interesting. I will talk more about that when I talk about Mr. Olmsted. But when folks think about Frederick Law Olmsted, they think about Central Park, they think about the Emerald Necklace. A lot of people don't realize that he had an incredibly diverse life with a lot of different jobs, and one of which, like Brown, he's a very, very powerful writer without formal education. So a lot of kind of synergy there. So thanks for bringing up that. And with that, I will take any questions if folks have any at this point.
When we had Bruce, question was the execution of Brown delayed because of his wounds, and the authorities wanted him to be in better condition so he would not appear to be so tragic?
I don't know that specifically. That does sound correct. Like I said, there was a lot going on about, political and how you're going to play this thing, because he is this martyr. And, a lot of people are deifying him. A lot of people are actually condemning him. So yes, it was complicated. He was pretty badly hurt. In the trial, he was actually, I believe, in the trial, when he was on trial, he was in a bed in the courtroom. He was that convalescent, but he did end up recovering mostly from his wounds. And they were, like I said, they were trying to rescue him. And also, one of the big things that gets brought up about John Brown is, he was crazy, he was insane. That was actually something one of his lawyers wanted to use as a defense. So that was very much in the time that there was this discussion about it. Of course, he wanted nothing to do with that. It was funny. One of the things they were going to introduce was some mental health challenges from his wife's family. And of course, they're like, well, that has nothing to do with, his genetic disposition. But the topic of, was John Brown crazy is something that comes up a lot even to this day. It was brought up in the course of his trial, actually, in November of 1859.
Great. I don't see any more questions. Phyllis just asked if we could make your book list available to the viewers, Bruce.
Oh,
don't know. But we could ask Todd. We could ask Todd to put that with the recording.
Yeah, or Jill. I've done that before with. I think I did it for my last presentation. I gave it to Jill, and she can send it out with the copy of the recording. So yes, I can do that. Because there's a lot of great stuff out there, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list I have, but for something who sometimes gets is a little bit of an obscure part of American history, certainly people are mining it all the time, and there's just a lot of interesting stuff that's been done within the last. Because after Stephen Oates' biography in 1970, there wasn't a ton more until about 20 years later. His was kind of the gold standard, and nothing really was written. Then in the 1990s, more stuff comes, and then a lot of it has been written in the last 20 years or so.
Great. I think that's all. Thanks everyone for all the great things you put in the chat box. I will share all that with Bruce. We appreciate you coming tonight.
Yes, very much so. I like the person who said they live near Harpers Ferry and Antietam. That's kind of like what I feel here. There's a lot of stuff around here to look at, and certainly down there is tons of stuff. I wish we had more time to spend it. So thanks everyone so much for coming. I hope I'll see you in March.
Bye.